For 47 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran ran one play, one, across every crisis, every confrontation, every negotiation, every moment when the pressure from outside threatened to overwhelm the structure inside, the regime ran exactly one play. It waited, it outlasted, it absorbed, it let time do what weapons could not do, and what diplomacy would not do, and what the patience of every American administration eventually failed to sustain. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days. Not because Iran was militarily stronger than the United States, because Iran understood that 444 days was a duration that American domestic politics could not sustain without producing the concessions that military force would not have produced. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years, not because the IRG was a superior fighting force to Saddam Hussein's army, because the IRG understood that 8 years was a duration that Iraq's external support network could not sustain indefinitely, while Iran's revolutionary fervor kept its soldiers fighting past the point where rational cost-benefit analysis would have told them to stop. Every nuclear negotiation followed the same template: talk enough. To prevent escalation, concede nothing structural. Wait for the American administration to rotate, for the European coalition to fracture, for the sanctions regime to develop the financial leakage that time always produces in multilateral enforcement operations. Time was not just Iran's strategy, time was Iran's weapon, the most reliable weapon in its arsenal, the weapon that never ran out of ammunition and never required resupply, until the blockade changed the arithmetic of time in a way that 47 years of institutional strategy had never modeled for. The proof that time is no longer working for Iran is not in any military engagement, any strike package result, any satellite imagery of destroyed facilities. It is in a single sentence buried inside the peace proposal that Iran submitted through Pakistani intermediaries. The proposal asks for the blockade to be lifted in less than 30 days, not 30 months, not 30 years, 30 days. An institution that owns the weapon of time does not set a 30-day deadline for the resolution of a conflict it could otherwise simply outlast. An institution that has run the waiting strategy successfully for 47 years does not voluntarily impose a 30-day clock on itself unless the situation that would exist at day 31 is worse than the situation of accepting whatever deal can be reached by day 30. The 30-day deadline is not a negotiating tactic. It is the regime's honest internal assessment of its own timeline, translated into diplomatic language and submitted through Pakistani intermediaries. It is the oil storage tanks at Kharg Island speaking through the Foreign Ministry's communication channels. It is the engineering reality of a system that has been pumping crude into tanks that have no outlet, that has been consuming the floating storage capacity assembled offshore, and that is now cutting crude output preemptively. Before the tanks overflow, before the forced shutdown, before the infrastructure catastrophe, because the engineers have done the calculation and the calculation says the uncontrolled version of what is coming is worse than the controlled version of managing the decline now while there is still time to manage it. Stay with me, because the 30-day deadline tells you more about the strategic reality of this conflict than any weapon system analysis or battle damage assessment produced in the past 64 days, and the details of what Iran's peace proposal actually contains, examined against the backdrop of what Besant described as a sprint toward the finish line, tell you exactly where the gap between Iran's public posture and its actual situation has arrived. Let us start with the operational mechanism that has made time Iran's enemy rather than its weapon. The U.S. naval blockade is not a weapons embargo or a sanctions regime or a diplomatic pressure campaign. It is a physical barrier between Iran's oil and the global buyers who would purchase it. Every barrel of Iranian crude that cannot reach a buyer because the blockade has turned back the tankers is a barrel of revenue that does not enter the state's treasury, not delayed, not reduced, not available through alternative channels that the regime can develop over time to partially offset the loss. Blocked, physically, completely, in the specific way that a wall rather than a fence blocks, not discouraging entry but preventing it. The difference between this and every previous American economic pressure campaign against Iran is precisely this physicality. Sanctions create legal and financial disincentives that sophisticated actors find ways to root around over time. Secondary sanctions threaten buyers with consequences that some buyers calculate are worth accepting for the right discount. The blockade has no routing around it. There is no discount that compensates a ship captain for a U.S. Navy destroyer ordering him to turn back. There is no financial calculation that makes defiance of a direct military interdiction economically rational. The sanctions created pressure, the blockade creates a wall, and walls do not erode at the rate that sanctions regimes erode. Secretary Besant described it with the specific metaphor of someone who understands both the duration and the current pace. A marathon over the past 12 months, now sprinting toward the finish line. That metaphor is doing work that the casual listener misses. A marathon runner who has been running at a sustainable pace for 12 months and is now sprinting toward the finish line has not changed direction, has not weakened, has not accepted a compromise, has assessed that the remaining distance is short enough that the maximum sustainable pace is now the appropriate pace. Sprinting toward the finish line is the statement of someone who can see the finish line, and the finish line in this metaphor is the point where the economic strangulation produces the institutional decision inside Iran that the entire pressure campaign was designed to produce. He said they are suffocating the regime, not squeezing. Not pressuring, suffocating. The precision of that word choice is deliberate. Squeezing produces discomfort that motivates accommodation. Suffocating produces the specific physiological response of an organism that is running out of the resource it requires to survive. The IRG is not being made uncomfortable by the blockade. It is being deprived of the oxygen, the oil revenue that every function of the regime depends on, the salary system, the proxy funding, the institutional loyalty purchases, the bureaucratic operation, the intelligence apparatus. The security forces that keep the population from organizing. Every one of these functions requires a continuous financial input that the oil revenue provided and that the blockade has cut. Suffocating is accurate. It is also the word that describes a process that, if allowed to continue long enough, becomes irreversible, the way banking. Dimension is the detail that reveals the most about the regime's strategic self-destruction. For years, the IRG ran its offshore financial operations through a banking architecture that depended critically on the way's institutional tolerance. Dubai's financial system, with its combination of sophistication, international connectivity, and historically relaxed enforcement posture toward financially opaque transactions, was the hub through which IRG-linked funds moved from the oil revenue that generated them to the operational accounts that deployed them. The way was not a partner of Iran. It was a financially convenient neighbor that made the specific calculation that the commercial benefit of not looking too carefully at the provenance of deposits outweighed the diplomatic and institutional cost of the friction that looking carefully would create. Iran fired 2,000 missiles and drones at the way during the war. And the way made a decision, not gradually, not diplomatically, immediately and completely. Way officials stopped looking the other way. They started looking directly. They identified the IRG-linked accounts and companies that had been operating through their financial system, documented them, and handed the documentation to American authorities for asset freezing. They became proactive where they had been permissive. Besant described the shift with the specific language of institutional accountability. The Gulf neighbors have been very wholesome and come forward and given us the details and allowed us to freeze those assets. The IRG is watching assets it accumulated over 47 years stolen from the Iranian people across every year of the regime's existence get frozen and drained very quickly. The word wholesome in that context is the most devastating diplomatic understatement in the entire conflict. Iran attacked the country whose banks were hiding its money. And the banks opened their records to the people Iran was fighting. This is not a strategic miscalculation. This is a strategic catastrophe of a specific kind, the kind where an institution destroys the protection it was depending on through the precise action it took to demonstrate strength. The IRG attacked the way to show it was still dangerous. The way responded by becoming the most cooperative party in the entire sanctions enforcement architecture. The attack produced the opposite of its intended effect with such completeness that the reversal can only be understood as the product of institutional decision-making that was optimized for the domestic narrative rather than the strategic reality. The Pakistan border smuggling operation deserves direct and honest engagement, because it is real, it is ongoing, and the American response to it, Trump saying he has great respect for Pakistan and for the Field Marshal and the Prime Minister when asked about his ally actively helping his adversary, is the kind of diplomatic answer that exists precisely because some questions do not have good answers. Pakistan's military establishment profits substantially from the border smuggling that is providing Iran with one of its few remaining economic lifelines. Pakistan is simultaneously the primary diplomatic channel through which every Iranian peace proposal reaches Washington. These two facts coexist in a relationship that is structurally incoherent and practically unavoidable. The United States cannot close the Pakistani channel without losing the diplomatic conduit that is the only available path to a negotiated resolution. It cannot publicly pressure Pakistan about border smuggling without producing the domestic political crisis in Islamabad that would collapse the cooperation it needs. So Trump says he has great respect for the Field Marshal and moves on, but here is the operational reality that makes the diplomatic incoherence practically irrelevant. One Iranian oil tanker carries approximately 2 million barrels of crude oil in a single transit. Replacing that volume through land border smuggling on motorbikes and trucks would require 17,000 motorbikes, each carrying a 5-gallon bucket, making simultaneous runs across the border. Not 17,000 per day, 17,000 to replace one tanker, one trip, the smuggling operation that Pakistan's military establishment is profiting from and that Iran is using as its last available economic artery is moving a volume of oil that is to the blockade's impact what a garden hose is to a pipeline. It is real. It is providing the regime with marginal revenue that is extending the timeline of the crisis by days rather than weeks. It is not changing the fundamental arithmetic that the 30-day deadline in Iran's peace proposal has already revealed the regime has internalized. The three-phase peace proposal that Iran submitted deserves to be read for what it actually is rather than for what its diplomatic framing presents it as. Phase 1 asks for the gradual opening of the strait and the lifting of the blockade on Iranian ports. Iran offers to manage the sea mine problem it created. This is the offer to remove its own obstacles as a concession. Phase 2 describes Iran's return to enrichment at 367% after an unspecified time limit, under a zero-storage principle requiring immediate export of enriched material. The proposal explicitly rejects dismantling nuclear infrastructure or destroying remaining Facilities. Phase 3 proposes strategic dialogue with Arab neighbors to build a regional security architecture, the same Arab neighbors Iran was attacking with drones and missiles 30 days before this proposal was submitted. The proposal, read plainly, asks the United States to lift the economic instrument that is suffocating the regime in exchange for nuclear constraints that leave the enrichment capability intact, the nuclear infrastructure intact, and the IRG that runs both also intact. It is a proposal that, if accepted in the form described, produces a pause in Iran's nuclear program without producing the permanent structural change that makes the program irreversible to reverse. 12 years from now, or 5 years, or whenever the political conditions change and the IRG calculates that the agreement's constraints can be eroded or abandoned, the capability is still there, the infrastructure is still there, the institutional knowledge is still there, only the agreement is gone and agreements between parties, with fundamentally different interests in their continuation, have a documented historical tendency to last exactly as long as the pressure that produced them. Trump assessed it accurately. He said he cannot imagine the proposal would be acceptable and that Iran has not paid a big enough price yet. He said the goal is to do this so nobody has to go back in 2 years or 5 years. That distinction between a deal that resolves the Iran problem and a deal that postpones it is the strategic distinction that the entire pressure campaign has been organized around. And the proposal Iran submitted is the proposal of an institution that wants the postponement, not the resolution. It wants to survive the current pressure and reach the future where the pressure has eased enough to resume the program. The 30-day deadline reveals the urgency. The proposal's rejection of infrastructure dismantlement reveals the priority. The urgency and the priority are in direct conflict with each other and with the American requirement that the resolution be permanent rather than temporary. The 85% figure that Trump cited, 85% of Iran's missile-making capability has been eliminated by the operations of the past 64 days, is the military balance context for everything. The proposal is trying to preserve. 85% of the capability that was there on February 27th is gone. The production facilities, the launch infrastructure, the supply chains, the personnel and technical knowledge that the Russian and Chinese evacuation operations removed from the facilities that survived American strikes, 85% eliminated. The remaining 15% is what the regime is asking the United States to negotiate around rather than eliminate. Trump said he would like to eliminate the rest. That statement is not rhetorical. The remaining 15% of Iran's missile-making capability is, by definition, the 15% that survived the first phase of operations because it was the hardest to find, the most deeply buried, the most carefully dispersed, the most technically challenging to destroy from altitude with conventional weapons. The Dark Eagle hypersonic deployment request is pending specifically because the assets that survived the first phase are the assets that the first phase's weapons could not adequately reach when the bombing restarts at a higher level and intensity, as Trump's Truth Social post describes as the alternative to an acceptable agreement. The higher level and the greater intensity are precisely about the 15% that remains. The oil storage situation is the engineering clock that makes all of the diplomatic and military analysis above operate on a specific timeline rather than an indefinite one. Iran has begun cutting crude output preemptively, not because the blockade has made further production technically impossible, because the storage situation has reached the point where the engineer's calculation is that the controlled reduction of output now is better than the uncontrolled overflow later. The officials say it is precautionary. The officials say the industry has enough experience and is not concerned. Apply the analytical principle that the senior Iranian oil spokespersons have trained us to apply. Focus less on what officials are saying and more on what they are doing. What they are doing is cutting output, voluntarily, ahead of the threshold, because the threshold, if reached, produces the infrastructure catastrophe that the controlled reduction is designed to prevent. When the storage tanks overflow and the wells are forced to shut down, the restart problem is the one that the regime's own officials acknowledge without fully describing. Years of sanctions, limited access to technology, infrastructure that has been operating under maintenance constraints that Western companies would not accept. Wells whose pressure dynamics have been affected by decades of operation under conditions that prioritized output over engineering sustainability. The wells that shut down under emergency pressure conditions do not restart in weeks. They restart in months, if at all, at an investment level that the regime does not have the revenue to fund because the blockade has cut the revenue that would fund it. The self-reinforcing loop of this dynamic: the blockade cuts revenue, the storage fills, the wells shut down, the revenue drops to zero rather than reduced, the restart requires investment that zero revenue cannot fund is the specific mechanism that Besant's sprint toward the finish line metaphor describes. The social consequences of all of this are arriving at the specific level where Iranian citizens experience them daily, in ways that penetrate the information blackout that the regime has maintained for 2 months. The car price warning from the Ministry of Industry telling consumers that price increases reflect artificial market manipulation rather than real economic conditions is the official statement of a government that knows prices are rising faster than any manipulation narrative can explain and is trying to get ahead of the public's understanding of why. The plans to import used cars are the practical acknowledgement that the new car market, dependent on supply chains the blockade has severed, cannot serve the demand that an economy of 87 million people generates. These are not abstract economic indicators. They are the daily arithmetic that Iranian consumers are doing at dealerships and grocery stores and currency exchanges, and they are not producing the conclusion that the official communications intend. The security forces are doing their own arithmetic. Late salary payments documented across the police force on multiple occasions, military personnel without wages for months, desertion rates increasing in ways that the internal security reports are documenting but that the state media is not covering. The institutional loyalty that keeps a security apparatus functional depends on the financial promise that the apparatus can fulfill its obligations to the people inside it. When that promise is being broken, not theoretically, not as a future risk, but as a current operational reality documented in field reports, the loyalty calculation that every individual security force member performs on behalf of their family and their future is being updated, not all at once, not uniformly, but individually, privately, rationally, in the specific way that produces the distributed behavioral shift that becomes visible as institutional collapse only after it has been happening invisibly for months. The regime's response to all of this, the storage crisis, the salary failures, the blockade compression, the failed peace proposal, the international isolation has been the response that regimes in terminal phases have consistently produced throughout documented history. More control, more suppression, more information blackout, more executions of protesters, more internet restrictions. More of the instruments that convert genuine discontent into performed compliance without addressing the material conditions that generate the discontent. These instruments work until the material conditions deteriorate past the threshold where the cost of expressing discontent publicly becomes lower than the cost of suppressing it privately. And the 47-year institutional history of the Islamic Republic, including the specific recent history of January 2026, when security forces killed thousands of protesters in the streets and an Iranian lawmaker later publicly acknowledged that the internet blackout exists specifically to prevent a recurrence, suggests that threshold has been approached before and is being approached again at higher levels of accumulated material grievance. The waiting strategy was not irrational. For 47 years, it was the correct institutional response to the specific pressure environment Iran faced. American domestic politics reliably ran out of patience. Sanctioned coalitions reliably developed leakage. Nuclear negotiations reliably produced interim arrangements that left the fundamental program intact. The strategy was calibrated to the reality it operated within. The blockade has changed that reality in ways that are structural rather than cyclical. Structural changes do not reverse when the administration rotates or when the coalition develops leakage or when the news cycle moves on to a different story. They are embedded in the physical architecture of the pressure, the tankers turned back, the storage filling, the wells being cut, the revenue disappearing in a way that time makes worse rather than better. The Islamic Republic's institutional identity was built on the premise that it had more time than its enemies. That premise is now false. The 30-day deadline in its own peace proposal is the regime's honest acknowledgement that the premise is false, and the gap between the proposal's content nuclear constraints that leave the IRG intact, the infrastructure intact, the capability intact, and the American requirement for permanent structural resolution tells you exactly how much the regime understands the situation it is in and how little it has accepted about what escaping that situation actually requires. Trump's statement that he would like to eliminate the remaining 15% of missile-making capability says everything about where the American position stands. Not constrain, not monitor, eliminate. The same vocabulary that applies to the proposal's inadequacy not yet paid a big enough price applies to the 15%. That remains. The sprint toward the finish line does not end at an agreement that leaves a capable adversary intact with a temporary constraint. It ends at the specific outcome that makes returning to this conflict in 2 years or 5 years structurally impossible rather than merely inadvisable. The gap between those two endpoints is the gap the next 48 hours are measuring, and the clock that is measuring them is not a diplomatic clock, it is an engineering clock. The crude output cuts are already happening. The floating storage is filling. The 30-day deadline is not a negotiating position, it is a confession. And confessions, in strategic terms, tell you more about what is actually happening than any official statement issued by a government that has every institutional reason to perform confidence it does not possess. Subscribe to World Brief Live right now and turn on notifications, because the 30-day deadline in Iran's own proposal is the most important single sentence in the entire diplomatic record of this conflict. Not the 14 points, not the 3 phases, not the enrichment percentages or the inspection regimes or the strategic dialogue proposals. The 30 days. That is Iran telling you what the blockade has produced. That is the waiting strategy's eulogy, written by the institution that ran it for 47 years, submitted through Pakistani intermediaries to the country whose blockade made continuing to run it impossible. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Iran's next response close the gap between its proposal and America's requirement enough to produce the agreement that Trump's Truth Social post describes as the alternative to the bombing starting at a higher level and intensity? Or does the 15% that survived, combined with the IRG's institutional survival logic, produce the outcome where the sprint toward the finish line becomes the run toward the next phase? This is World Brief Live. The storage tanks are filling, the output cuts are happening, the 30-day clock is running, and 47 years of waiting strategy has run out of time. Stay informed, stay ahead.